instead of stealing it from us, we'll hire you to protect it from your fellow raiders. And the Rus said, okay, and with their power, eventually became the actual rulers of these local people, establishing the Rurik Dynasty. Size. Russia is the biggest country in the world, with a size of over 17 million square kilometers, a federation made up of 85 federal subjects, republics, provinces, and territories, etc. Although it looks far bigger than it actually is, and if we use this tool to see a country's true size, we can see how the distance from the equator distorts a country's size on a typical map. But still, even in its true size depiction, it's big, far ahead of anyone else in the top 5 of biggest countries in the world, and in fact, almost double the size of each of the 3 runner-ups, Canada, USA, or China. A lot of times I used to look at a map and think, how did Russia get this big? So in this video, we're going to find out how. There are 2 questions we need to answer. 1, how is it possible for them to expand as much? And 2, when and how did they expand into each part of the territory? Answering the first question, the answer has very much to do with geography. There are 3 factors that explain the ease with which the Russian state expanded. Low population, the fact that the few people who existed were nomads, and the fact that most of the territory is flat, save a few obvious exceptions. Low population meant that a nation could just claim a large plot of land back then. If there was no one to challenge that claim, then it became theirs. Vast tracts of what Russia is today were unpopulated or barely populated at the time that they were annexed by the Russians. So all the Russians had to do was show up and say, hey, this is ours now. There weren't big settlements with fortified walls and kings with large armies that the Russians had to defeat with great effort in order to conquer. Now don't get me wrong, the Russians did have enemies, especially to the south and even in some cases to the east, not to mention their endless wars with Europe in the west, but their vast expansion into Siberia was mostly simple in military terms. And to further help the expansionist cause, a flat territory makes for easier and faster traveling, allowing for an even easier annexation. So that's question 1 answered. Now let's move to the main second question by briefly going over Russian history and understanding when and how they annexed each part of what is now Russia. The roots of Russia lie in the invasion of northern raiders from Scandinavia called the Rus, probably where the country's name comes from. These raiders arrived in towns mostly populated by Slavic people who, among other things, traded their goods. The Rus raided these people, stealing their goods and selling them for themselves. At one point, the locals had enough and said, okay, instead of stealing it from us, we'll hire you to protect it from your fellow raiders. And the Rus said, okay, and with their power, eventually became the actual rulers of these local people, establishing the Rurik Dynasty. They formed a state known as the Kievan Rus, where a Rurik Grand Prince of Kiev ruled over a sort of federation of other Rurik princes, each with their principality across the then smaller Russian lands. Eventually, after many other political and military events, a major one took place, the Mongol invasion, and this is where Moscow or Muscovy becomes the new center of power in Russia, paving the way for its and then Russia's expansion. The Mongol invasion led to the subjugation of all Russian states to the Mongols themselves. Out of luck or political and diplomatic skill, Muscovy gained the privilege of collecting the tribute from other Russian states in the north to give to the Mongols in the south, acting as sort of a middleman. This situation allowed them to gain some economic power, also attracting people to live there since it was less likely to be raided by the Mongols. After strengthening and taking advantage of the collapse and separation of the Mongol Empire, Muscovy rallied a few Russian states against the Mongols and defeated them, conquering part of their lands and most importantly, ending the subjugation of the Rurik princes towards the Mongols. There were many battles and even many wars until the Mongols were fully defeated, but Ivan III's 1480 victory over the Great Horde is cited as the restoration of Russian independence 240 years after the Mongols had invaded and conquered Kiev. A once again independent Russian state composed of many principalities existed, with Moscow's Grand Prince at the head, and from here on out, they expanded. The first great expansion of Moscow's territory was led by this Grand Prince, Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, who was crowned in 1502. Ivan brought many Russian duchies directly under the rule of Moscow, taking away the titles from the nobles who had them. After that, he went to war with the Republic of Novgorod, who controlled much of northern Russia. He won, and so Novgorod ceded a lot of its land to Moscow, about 4/5 of its total territory. After Ivan died, his son Vasily III continued his policy of expansion, annexing the last autonomous provinces within the Grand Principality, also capturing Smolensk from Poland-Lithuania in 1514, as well as expanding Russian influence along the Volga River. A fun fact is that he was the first Grand Duke of Moscow who adopted the title of Tsar and the usage of the Byzantine double-headed eagle. After Vasily came another Ivan, but this one wasn't known as great. He was known as terrible. He was declared Emperor of all Rus in 1547 and established the Tsardom of Russia, with Moscow as the predominant state, or the capital if you will. During his youth, Russia conquered the Khanate of Kazan and the Khanate of Astrakhan, with the latter being important to further control the Volga River trade route. He also lost some land, Livonia and Ingria, in a war against the Livonian Confederation, Poland-Lithuania, Denmark, and Sweden. But the most important expansion during Ivan the Terrible's reign was the one towards Siberia. At this time, in the second half of the 16th century, Russia started a large-scale exploration and colonization of Siberia, a process which would take a long time to complete. Ivan the Terrible's son, Fyodor, took little interest in ruling, and it was his brother-in-law Boris who had the real power. Fyodor died without any children, leading to the extinction of the Rurik dynasty, who had directly led the Russian people since the 13th century after their arrival from the north, and his regent, Boris, became Tsar himself in 1598, the first one that wasn't from the Rurik dynasty. Boris's policy was generally pacific, and the only relevant expansion in the west seems to be the recovery of some towns from Sweden in 1595. But he did have an important role in expanding Russia's population and territory in the east. He built towns and fortresses along the eastern and southern borders to keep the Tatar and Finnic tribes in order, and he colonized Siberia with many new settlements, as well as conquering the local Khanate of Sibir. His son and heir, Fyodor II, only ruled for a few months, from April to June of 1605, and didn't really have time to write his name in the history of Russia's expansion. However, he did create a map of Russia, still preserved today and re-edited throughout that century. He may not have contributed to expanding the Russian territory, but he did contribute to depicting it, allowing us today to see how it was back then. And as we can see here, Russian control was already vast at this point, but did not yet stretch too far into the east. With Fyodor II's death, a period known as the Time of Troubles began in Russian history, lasting from 1605 to 1613, although arguably it had begun with the end of the Rurik dynasty in 1598. And this is a particularly odd thing about that period. When the last Rurik Tsar, Fyodor I, died, his heir would have been his younger brother, Dmitry, but Dmitry died before that, leading to the regent, Boris, becoming the Tsar, and then to this gigantic crisis. And so, during the time of the Troubles, a number of fake Dmitrys showed up, pretending to be the rightful heir, who they pretended had miraculously survived, therefore having the right to the throne, who would restore the Rurik dynasty and end the Troubles. And what's crazier is that it worked. Whether out of convenience or actual belief, local nobles supported not one, not two, not three, but 4 false Dmitrys. The first even became Tsar for a year, but let's not get lost in these historical details. The time of the Troubles was an incredibly serious crisis for Russia, and so, understandably, there was no territorial expansion during this time. In fact, the only changes were losses of territory as a result of a war against Poland-Lithuania, who conquered Severia and reconquered Smolensk. This period finally ended in 1613 with the election of Michael Romanov as Tsar by a council of nobles, establishing the Romanov dynasty, which ruled Russia until the revolution of 1917. Michael Romanov ruled from 1613 to 1645, alongside his father until 1633, and through his reign, the project of colonizing Siberia, begun by Ivan the Terrible, was finally completed. Russia conquered most of Siberia, a feat largely accomplished by the armies of the Cossacks and largely financed by the merchant Stroganov family, reaching the Pacific Ocean by the end of Michael's reign. This was, in terms of size, the period of largest territorial expansion in all Russian history. Another task he faced territorially was to put an end to the conflicts with Sweden and Poland, which had begun during the time of the Troubles, through the peace deals of Stopovo with Sweden and Deolino with Poland. With Sweden, Russia gained Novgorod and other land it had lost during the war, but also renounced all claims to Estonia and Livonia, also losing part of Karelia and Ingria to the Swedes. With Poland, the previous conquest of Smolensk was accepted by the Russians. Oh, and another term of the peace was the return of Michael's father, who had been taken prisoner, the one we just saw ruled alongside him for a while. Alexei succeeded Michael, and in his reign, new wars against Sweden and Poland took place. The peace treaty with Sweden did not see any territorial changes, as far as I could find out. All that happened was Russia giving up on territorial gains it had made during the war. However, the peace with Poland-Lithuania in 1667 saw great territorial gains for Russia. In this map, we can see those in dark green. Noticeably, Smolensk once again changed hands, being recovered by the Tsardom. Parts of Ukraine, especially including the city of Kiev, was taken as well. Supposed to be a 2-year temporary transfer, it was made permanent 20 years later, when Russia bought the city for 146,000 rubles. And so, the original seat of power of the Rurik dynasty in Russia was recovered, but this time for the control of the new Romanov Tsars. Alexei's son, another Fyodor III, only contributed with a small expansion, conquering the Kazim Khanate in 1681, and he was succeeded by his two sons, Ivan V and especially Peter I, known as Peter the Great. The two brothers ruled Russia together from 1682 to 1696, and then when Ivan died, Peter began ruling alone until 1725. A real administrative mess. They were co-czars, and Ivan was the senior czar, but for the first 7 years it was their sister who ruled as a regent. Anyway, during this reign, mostly attributed to Peter the Great, some important expansions took place. Peter wanted to modernize and industrialize Russia, and he knew a key necessity was improving Russia's naval power. And so, he went to war with the Ottomans to acquire access to the Black Sea. In 1698, he conquered the Ottoman fortress of Azov, gaining access to the sea and establishing Russian influence in the area. However, he lost these a few years later. After having established a foothold in the Black Sea in the south, he now wanted a foothold in the Baltic Sea in the north, at the time controlled by Sweden. Although this time he counted with the help of Denmark and Poland-Lithuania. It's weird how these nations were constantly at war with each other and constantly switching sides and allies. In this Great Northern War, the Russians conquered and annexed Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and a substantial part of Karelia, allowing the founding of the city of St. Petersburg in 1703, which then became the capital of the Tsardom of Russia, rebranded by Peter as the Russian Empire in 1721. In his final years, Peter the Great took the additional title of Emperor of all Russias, reinforcing the multinational character of the empire. During Peter's reign, the expansion into Central Asia also began, although initially with little success. In 1717, a military expedition attempted to conquer the Khanate of Kiev, but was completely defeated and destroyed. But they did successfully expand into the south, although only temporarily. The Persian Safavid Empire to the south was in decline. Because of this, Peter launched the Russo-Persian War in 1722, which began Russian influence in the Caucasus and Caspian Sea region. The Safavids were forced to hand over a few territories to Russia, but 12 years later, they were returned to the Persians. Peter was succeeded by his wife, Catherine I, who did not expand Russia's territory that much. She was, however, the first woman to rule Imperial Russia, opening up the path for other female rulers in the future, such as Catherine the Great. Other successors followed after Catherine I's death. Peter II, Anna, who returned more territories to the Persians in the Caucasus, but recovered Azov from the Ottomans, Ivan VI, Elizabeth, who conquered southwest Karelia from the Swedes, and then Peter III. But these focused more on internal development and participating in Europe's political and military life, instead of continuing Russian expansion, which is somewhat understandable. Such a big amount of land had already been taken that it was important to stabilize it and deal with other issues before going off on further conquests. The next period of significant changes came in 1762 with Catherine II, known as Catherine the Great, a period of gigantic territorial expansion. During her reign, she extended the borders of the Russian Empire by around 520,000 square kilometers, absorbing South Ukraine, Crimea, the North Caucasus, right bank Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Courland after wars and subsequent victories against the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland-Lithuania collapsed during her reign, and so the entire territory of the Commonwealth was divided between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, as we can see on this map here, with Russia taking the eastern and largest part of the territory. In the Far East, Russians also became active in fur trapping in Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands, allowing for the expansion into this land. And a rivalry with China also began over both empires wanting to expand into Central Asia. Catherine the Great's commitment towards expansion seemed to be extremely strong, having once said, "I shall not die until I have ejected the Turks from Europe, suppressed the pride of China, and established trade with India," a set of goals which she did not fulfill despite her other great achievements. Her son Paul I, however, opposed Catherine's policies and instead preferred to pursue a more peaceful diplomatic path. The only expansion Russia saw during his reign was when Persia officially ceded part of Georgia to them in 1813, and the early start of the colonization of Alaska before Russia sold it to the US. Paul awarded a monopoly of fur trading to a local company and in exchange expected it to establish new settlements in Alaska and to carry out an expanded colonization program. This was in 1799. The colonization took place but was stopped with the Alaska Purchase by the US in 1867. Paul's son and heir, Alexander I, could not, however, run away from territorial issues because during his reign, Napoleon invaded Russia and half of Europe as well. Other than fighting off Napoleon's invasion, several additional territories were annexed during Alexander's reign between 1801 and 1825. Eastern Georgia, the Grand Duchy of Finland, Western Georgia, Bessarabia, Moldova, the Duchy of Warsaw, Georgia, Dagestan, northern Azerbaijan, and northern Armenia. His successor, Nicholas I, conquered the remaining parts of Azerbaijan and Armenia in 1828. These and previous gains were results of new wars against Persia, Finland, and the Ottomans. During the reign of Alexander II, several other territory expansions were achieved. China ceded lands north of the Amur River and east of the Ussuri River as consequence of their defeat in the Second Opium War in 1860, and this established Russian control over part of Manchuria. The conquest of Kazakhstan, which had started in 1730, was finally finished in 1863, and in 1866 they conquered Uzbekistan, confirming this reign as a period of great expansion into Central Asia. North Turkmenistan was also taken, defeating the Khanate of Khiva and avenging the utter defeat they had previously suffered, as well as Kyrgyzstan and West Tajikistan with the annexation of the Khanate of Kokand in 1876. In the Far East, Sakhalin was taken in a border agreement with Japan, and another war against the Turks in 1878 resulted in the annexation of the Kars and Batum oblasts. His son Alexander III wrapped up the conquest of Central Asia, defeating the Turkmens in 1885 and conquering South Turkmenistan, exploring the Pamir Plateau, which was sparsely populated and equivalent to current-day East Tajikistan. Finally, the last major territorial change in the Russian Empire took place with the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, who lost South Sakhalin to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. During his reign, the 1917 revolution took place. The Romanov dynasty followed the same fate as the Ruriks did before them, although through different means, and became extinct. The Russian Empire was no more. The end of the empire caused several territorial losses as well. After the revolution, Poland and Finland became independent. Russia's area of effective direct control varied greatly during the Russian internal conflict from 1917 to 1922, and various territories gained temporary independence until 1920, before being re-annexed by the Soviets. Eventually, the revolutionary government regained control of most of the former Eurasian lands of the Russian Empire, and in 1922 rejoined with Belarus, Transcaucasia, and Ukraine as the four constituent republics of a new state, the Soviet Union. By the end of World War II, the Union had additionally annexed a number of other territories. The dissolution of the USSR led to the creation of independent post-Soviet states, with the Russians declaring their own independence in December of 1991 and changing their name to the Russian Federation, being reduced to the territory they have today. In the 21st century, a few other conflicts have led to an increase of Russian territorial control in the Caucasus and in Crimea. So that was a very brief overview of how Russia got so big, going over the history of Russia since its creation with the arrival of the Rurik princes from Scandinavia all the way to modern times, passing through the Kievan Rus Federation of Principalities, to the Mongol invasions, the return of Russian sovereignty through the Grand Duchy of Moscow, the endless wars with Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottomans, the colonization of Siberia, the conquest of Central Asia Khanates, and even the temporary colony in Alaska, the loss of land that took place with the 1917 revolution and its recovering and even expanding with the Soviet Union, and the further loss after the USSR was dissolved until today. And what I think we can understand is that Russian land expansion was a slow process of many centuries. While we can associate final conquests to specific dates and specific rulers, many of these were the culmination of centuries-long processes of annexation and conquest through many attempts and wars, especially in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Siberia, or the many territories they constantly disputed with Poland, Sweden, Persia, or the Ottomans. Did I miss any important part of Russia's territorial expansion or any other important information about this? Let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to catch future ones and support me on Patreon if you want access to extra content and a behind the scenes look. I will see you next time for more general knowledge.